At the end of the last talk, I referred to several events which took place in the 1770s, very dramatic events, very significant events, but pointed out that not one of them led to war. But of course, right at the end, I talked about the Battle of Bunker Hill, which most definitely did lead to war. So this talk, number 6, is the last one. So it would appear that I've got to get through the account of the war pretty damn quick. In fact, I cheat. I don't really do that. What I do is make some observations about the war, which may come under the heading of not trying to tell you anything new, not trying to convince you of anything, merely trying to perhaps rearrange the material a little bit and say, have you ever thought of looking at it like this? Anyway, I want to start by reminding you that there were great divisions between the two sides. It was not a case of all Americans against all Englishmen. There were many people in the colonies, the Loyalists, who disagreed with the war and who later on left America rather than stay under a government of which they disapproved. In the same way, in England, there were many people who thought it was wrong to fight a war against the Americans. Why? Because the Americans were not a foreign power. The Americans were Englishmen. There were many people in Britain, England, sorry, for the purposes of this talk, they're practically interchangeable. Many in England, because they saw the Americans as English, British, they felt that this was a civil war. We could not fire on our own fellow countrymen. So there are different ways of looking at things. So here are one or two observations, some of which you may be aware of, some of which you may not. For example, that famous historian I told you about, Samuel Morrison. He pointed out, amongst many other home truths, that the colony of New York had more soldiers fighting for George III than it did fighting for George Washington. What was happening in all the other colonies, I'm afraid I can't tell you, but it is significant, isn't it, that it points out quite clearly that not all the colonists were fighting the war against King George. As far as the British Army were concerned, it was just another war. They're in the army, they're there to follow orders and do as they're told. If they're packed off on overcrowded boats to face the horrors of the Atlantic for 4 or 5 weeks in order to fight a war in some distant country which none of them knew anything about it at all, well, orders were orders. In fact, there were quite a few soldiers there who weren't English at all. The English government went over to Germany and hired a batch of mercenaries and sent them over to do the fighting as well. Well, they're not going to have their hands on their hearts, are they? They're going to have their thoughts on their pay packet. On the other hand, on the other side, the American colonists, of course, were fighting on their own home ground. The ones who really felt this deeply and the ones who were prepared to go the whole hog, they were fighting for their land, for their families, for their town, for their colony. And of course, liberty and freedom. Very, very serious, very high principles. So what did that do? How did that affect the respective attitudes of the English and the Americans? Attitudes were different for one thing, tactics for another. The British soldiers who came over, the professionals, the Redcoats, were used to fighting wars, all right, and they fought in lots of places. How did you usually fight a war? If you were in the infantry, your general found a suitable place on the battlefield which favoured his tactics. His troops lined up in nice straight red lines, hence the phrase, the thin red line. 9 times out of 10, the enemy did the same with their line, whether it was red or blue or black, didn't matter. And these two lines banged away at each other till one or other of them gave in. The Americans didn't do that. They didn't line up in nice straight lines in red uniforms for a very simple reason. They didn't have any red uniforms, couldn't afford them. They couldn't afford uniforms at all. It was as much as most of them could do to afford a weapon. There were no munitions factories in America. American agents had to go all over the world, all over Europe, trying to buy guns and material of war. Because they didn't line up in nice straight lines and bang away at each other, because their soldiers were not experienced in that sort of war, because they didn't have the uniforms, they didn't have the drill, they didn't have the drill manual, all that sort of thing. So they had to fight a war a different way, what they were used to. They were used to fighting, all right. They were used to firing guns. Many of them were very good, much better marksmen than the average Englishman, who with his musket was lucky if he hit a barn door at 50 yards. When their soldiers lined up in straight lines, they didn't aim at a single soldier in the other line. They just aimed at the line. They're bound to hit somebody. But the Americans were used to going out on their own, hunting, stalking, hiding behind trees, laying ambushes, and all the rest of it. To the British, this was almost amounted to cheating. Why did they not line up in straight lines and be shot at as the British were? That was the way to fight a war. But no, they skulked in the greenery and picked off the English redcoats, who, with their colour of their uniform, were God's gift to a sniper or a man laying an ambush. One young English officer wrote, either in his diary or he wrote afterwards, or he wrote home. He said, "The Americans are very brave from behind a tree." What stuck in his throat was not being defeated. All right, he didn't like being defeated, but he could accept that. What he could not accept was the way the Americans fought, how they won their so-called victory. Hiding behind a tree, skulking. It's interesting that 100 years later, the American ethic was completely different. If you look at the legends of the Wild West, what was demanded of a man in the Wild West was that, like the British redcoat, he went out into the main street and he stood out in the open and he faced his enemy and he drew and he fired. The villains who shot men in the back from behind a tree in the Wild West were considered beneath contempt. Isn't it funny how attitudes change? Anyway, now a word about George Washington, who was elected or chosen, agreed to serve as the Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces. Here's another irony. As far as I'm aware, Washington never won a single pitched battle. Well, they didn't fight many pitched battles. They couldn't. All Washington did was win the war, which was a different matter altogether. What Washington did was to hold them together in the worst possible times. I'm given to understand that the worst time was between 1777 to 78, the so-called cold winter, when the American army were camped in a place called Valley Forge. And it appeared to have been a very long winter, and the American army suffered from lack of supplies, lack of shelter. They suffered a large number of desertions. It was curiously, it started very optimistically. I've read somewhere that early on in the winter, there were dinner parties with ladies present and wine and everything. But by the end of the winter, a lot of Washington's troops had no shirts, and no shoes. So what Washington did, his contribution, was to support morale, to refuse to give in when the times were at their very worst. And in this sense, he has in common the same quality that Winston Churchill showed in 1940, as you well know. Lots of books have been written about Washington, lots of books have been written about Churchill, and many historians speculate as to what the real nub of their contribution, what was the essence of their contribution. As I said, Washington didn't win battles. All he did was win the war. And just as Churchill in 1940 held fast when nearly every other member of his cabinet was for being, as they said, realistic, we've got to face facts, we've got to give in, live to fight another day. And Churchill said, no, we hang on. And Washington did exactly the same. He simply refused to give in. And slowly, very slowly, opinion came round to him. Then in 1776, as you know, was signed the Declaration of Independence, July the 4th, 1776, a great document, one of the great documents of human rights in the whole of history. But I'm given to understand that although the first part of the document was taken up with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the great statement of truths and human rights, a good deal of the rest of the Declaration of Independence was taken up with justifying what they had done. Hardly surprising if you stop to think about it. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to show that the Americans were wrong in what they did. I'm not trying to show that they had the wrong principles. I'm simply trying to point out that in the official, legal, formal opinion of the time, what the Americans had done in raising arms against their legal sovereign, they had, in the legal code of the day, committed high treason. Whether history subsequently justifies that is another matter. But at that time, they had committed high treason. So they had to do something to say, yeah, well, we may have committed what you think is high treason, but we had a pretty damn good reason for doing it. It was only human that they should try to do that. So if they had lost, we don't stop to think about that now. It's all about victory because everybody knows that they won. But if they had lost, what might have happened in the way of punishments and retribution and trials? Makes you think. Then in 1777 came one of those events right out of the blue, which stood history on its head. The British government had to find a way of dealing with this rebellion, obviously, and it was enormous. As I said, it spread over 1,500 miles. And for once, they had a bright idea. How would it be, they said, if we try and split the rebellion in half? The powerhouse of the rebellion is in the north, in New England, Massachusetts, New York, and so on. Supposing we split them off from the center and the south. You know the old Latin tag, divide and rule. If we can split them in half, with any luck, we can knock off the two halves one by one. So the plan was for a British army to march down from Canada, which Britain now owned. Another British army stationed in the colony of New York was to march north. They would join up, and between them, they would be too powerful to be defeated by what American armies were in the field. Well, the idea may have been brilliant, but the execution of it was absolutely catastrophic. Everything went wrong, and the general coming down from Canada, General Burgoyne, known to his own troops as Gentlemanly Johnny, quite what that meant about his military ability, I don't know. But anyway, Burgoyne found when he got to the rendezvous point that there was no army coming up from New York. And he was faced with two American armies. There were some skirmishes, but it was quite clear to Burgoyne that it was a pointless sacrifice to continue. So he surrendered. The famous surrender at Saratoga. And the news of this almost unbelievable event, a British army of Redcoats was going to surrender to a colonial army. The echoes of this resounded round Europe, as you can imagine. And looking back, everybody now realizes that this was the turning point in the war. Why? Because it gave the Americans some allies. The French, who had hesitated up to then, looked at the result of Saratoga, decided that the odds had swung the other way. So if they joined in now on the side of the Americans, they had a very good chance of winning the war and getting their own back for all the other wars they'd lost against the British. For very similar reasons, the Spanish declared war as well. And within another year, Holland, the Dutch, had declared war. So we now had four enemies, the Americans, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. And you know the saying, nature never rains, but it pours. That was not the end of it. During the war, as I said before, American agents were desperately sailing all over the place, trying to buy arms, ammunition. Uh, and there are always arms dealers ready to do business, aren't there? And they were shipping munitions of war to America. Now, the British, obviously, their intelligence system may not have been all that good. They had tumbled to that. So they sent out their ships to look for these ships from other countries, which were officially neutral. They hadn't declared war on us. And to search their ships for what they called contraband of war. They were attacking and searching and seizing and confiscating goods from neutral ships, from the navies of, say, Sweden or Prussia or Russia or Portugal. In effect, the British Navy was chucking its weight about all over the high seas, justifying it by saying that they were searching for contraband of war sent by neutral powers who had no business to be interfering in the war. Well, the neutral powers complained bitterly to the British Admiralty. They took no notice at all because of the reasons they had just stated. So these neutral powers decided that they too would not join in the war, but they would make it clear that if British ships made any attempt to search neutral ships anymore, they would face gunfire. So Prussia and Austria and Sweden and Russia and Portugal joined what was called the Armed Neutrality in 1780. Now then, the British Navy always prided itself on the fact that Britannia ruled the waves, and they were usually able to prove it. But now they had not only the French Navy against them, they had the Spanish Navy, which was no small matter. They had the Dutch Navy, which was also no small matter. Now they had to face naval forces from Prussia, Sweden, Russia, and Portugal. We were in effect facing not one, but 7 naval powers. And not even the British Navy could take on 7 all at once. It meant, in effect, that the British Navy lost control of the sea, which was the vital strategic element to getting troops across the Atlantic and supplies and all the rest of it. It meant that a few years later, in 1781, a British general, Lord Cornwallis, was besieged at Yorktown and was hanging on because he fully expected a squadron of ships from the British Navy loaded with English troops. He expected them to arrive outside the harbour at Yorktown to relieve the siege, which he was suffering from. Unfortunately, the squadron which arrived was not English, it was French. Cornwallis had to accept the fact that there was going to be no relief of the siege. And like Burgoyne at Saratoga, curiously, Cornwallis was forced to surrender on the very same day, October the 17th, as Burgoyne, was forced to surrender at Saratoga. That was in October, as I said, 1781. The war then, to all intents and purposes, we now see, looking back, was over. The treaty was not signed, in fact, until 1783. But there's a lot of, there was a lot of haggling to go on and a lot of travel too. Don't forget, travel was very slow. And not only was it slow in Europe, the American delegates had to come all the way across the Atlantic. When I was a small boy and had early history lessons, it always used to puzzle me that the war was over in 1 year, but it was very often a year or 2 years before the treaty was signed. And I thought, well, why don't they sign the treaty if they've finished fighting the war? Why don't they, have a cup of tea, a good bath, a good night's sleep, and sit down the following day and sign the treaty? Well, because of the difficulties of travel, couldn't do that. So in 1783, the Peace of Versailles was signed, and the United States was officially born and was officially recognized by the British government. A new power had come into being. One of the great ifs of history during the peace negotiations, which were attended by Benjamin Franklin, one of the great American folk heroes. Apparently, Franklin said to one of the English delegates, because it was fairly new that we had only recently taken over Canada. We'd only got hold of Canada in 1763. Here we were, only 20 years later, being forced to give up the whole of the eastern seaboard of America and all the land down to the Ohio River. So Franklin, being logical, apparently said to one of the English delegates, "You wouldn't care to throw in Canada as well while you're about it, would you?" Perhaps luckily for England, the answer was no, we wouldn't. But just think, what an if. So that was America. They got their birth certificate, if you like, and they very nearly got Canada as well. What happened in England? As I said right at the start of these talks, the English were furious at having lost. It was unheard of. It was, as I said, almost unfair. But the fury was not directed against the Americans. The fury was directed against their own government for making such a terrible mess of it. Not only that, the British government, having lost 13 colonies, having been forced to give way before a full-scale rebellion, now looked at their other possessions. Would this virus of sedition spread across the St. Lawrence River to Canada? Would the same thing happen in the Canadian colonies? Didn't know. After all, 20 years before, it had seemed very unlikely in America. Could it happen in Canada? Could it happen further down south in the British colonies in the West Indies? These terribly valuable sugar islands? Supposing we lost them? Even more frightening, what about something even closer to home, Ireland? Ireland lived in a semi-permanent state of unrest, revolt, rebellion, terrorism, whatever you like. Ireland, as far as the English government was concerned, was a permanent pain. Would revolution spread to Ireland? The British government had its share of headaches, and another tiny headache that they had to face, the oddest headache of all. Up until the war, the English government had very conveniently dumped all their convicted convicts in America, transported them to America. Well, they couldn't now. It was a foreign power. So where on earth, quite literally, were they going to send their convicts? There's a lot of debate about that, and they consider some very funny places indeed. What was the result for France? Well, there's an irony here. The American War of Independence, against which they fought against Britain, they'd fought 4 other wars against Britain and lost them all. But they won the War of American Independence, of course, thanks to the Americans. Ironically, it led to more trouble than all the other wars put together because the deficit was so enormous that they couldn't find a way of paying it off. And in the end, they were so desperate that a few years after the war was over, they decided to summon their, what you might call their parliament, which hadn't met for 175 years. It was a dictatorship, you see. And that met in May 1789. And as you know, 1789 was a magical date in French history, as 1776 is in American history, the French Revolution. Within 2 or 3 months of the assembly of that parliament, revolution had begun. The Bastille had been stormed in July, and within 3 or 4 years, the French king had lost his head on the guillotine. What was the result for America? Well, as I've said, and blindingly obvious, victory. They had won, they had proved their point, they had vindicated the rights of man, they had a new nation. They had a wonderful story to tell their grandchildren. They had a legend, and they've been proud of it, and it's the sort of thing that brings a lump to the throat and has done for Americans ever since, and rightly so too. The remarks I've made, as I repeat, have only been observations, not particularly well-informed observations. I'm not an expert. I've said nothing new, and I've tried to ensure that every major comment that I made has been endorsed by American historians with impeccable credentials. I hope I've not given offence. Whether I knock holes in the legend or not doesn't matter. You love a legend not for its perfections. You love a legend in spite of its imperfections. Thanks to that war, the Americans, I said, had an ideal, a legend, something to bring a lump in the throat. They now had a faith. And what is man without a faith? And you know what faith is, don't you? As the schoolboy famously put it in his history essay, faith, he wrote, faith is believing in something which you know is not true. Bye.